I have a memory from childhood that I have never been able to explain. I am 7 years old, standing at the edge of the woods behind my grandmother's house in rural Vermont. It is late October, the kind of afternoon that smells like cold earth and dead leaves and something underneath both of those things that has no name. I am standing at the tree line because something at the tree line is standing back. It has no shape I can describe cleanly. It is tall in a way that doesn't match the trees around it. It is still in a way that living things are not still, not frozen, not hiding, but present in the way a wall is present. Completely without apology. It is looking at me, and I know it is looking at me not because I can see its eyes but because I can feel the specific weight of being seen. I stood there for what felt like a long time. Then my grandmother called my name from the porch and I turned and ran to her, and when I looked back the thing was gone and I spent the next 23 years telling myself it had never been there. Then I took the job, and I stopped being able to tell myself that. The listing found me. That is the only way I know how to describe it. I wasn't searching for work. I had a position at a research university in Boston, a comfortable if unremarkable career in ethnographic documentation, a small apartment I had lived in long enough that the floorboards knew my footstep patterns. I was not looking for anything. But there it was one morning in my inbox, addressed personally, with a subject line that read simply, "We think you are exactly what this work requires." The email was from an organization called the Voss Institute for Anomalous Anthropology. I had never heard of it. When I searched for it, almost nothing came back, a single sparse webpage, no social media presence, no academic citations, no news coverage. Just a white page with black text and a logo that was either very minimalist or very old, I couldn't tell which. The text on the page said only, "We study those who were here before us. We are looking for someone willing to listen." The email offered a salary that made me check it 3 times. It offered relocation. It offered what it called full immersive access to subjects no other researcher in the world had documented. And at the very bottom, in smaller text than everything else, it said, "Prior unexplained experiences are considered an asset, not a liability. We have found that the people best suited to this work are those who already know, on some level, that the world is larger than it appears." I sat with that last line for a long time. Then I replied. They moved fast after that. Within 48 hours a representative had called, a man named Aldrich, with a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet, who answered every question I asked with precise, unhurried patience and deflected every question I didn't know I should be asking. He told me the institute operated a research facility in the Pacific Northwest. He told me I would be interviewing subjects. He told me the subjects were non-human. He said it the way you say something you've said many times to many people who all react the same way and you've stopped expecting any other reaction. Non-human, I repeated. Non-human, he confirmed. Entities that predate recorded human civilization in most cases. Entities that have been in contact with human populations for as long as human populations have existed, in forms and capacities that mainstream science has consistently failed to adequately account for. You mean? I mean exactly what I said, he said. No more and no less. The work is documentation. Interview methodology. You would be doing what you already do, with subjects no one else has had access to. I should have said no. Every rational part of me that had been carefully constructed over 30 years of education and empirical training was composing the polite decline, even as the rest of me, the part that had stood at a tree line at 7 years old and felt the weight of something ancient looking back, was already saying yes. I flew to Portland on a Tuesday. A car met me, black, unmarked, driver who communicated entirely in nods. We drove for nearly 3 hours into the Cascade Range, on roads that progressively narrowed until they were barely roads at all, through forest so old and dense it pressed against the windows like it was curious. My phone lost signal somewhere in the second hour. The facility appeared without warning. One moment there was only forest. The next, a compound, low buildings, utilitarian, surrounded by a perimeter fence that was less aggressive than it was definitive. A boundary that said not keep out, but here is where one thing ends and another begins. Aldrich met me at the gate. He was older than his voice had suggested, late 60s, with the kind of stillness that takes decades to develop. He shook my hand and looked at me with dark eyes that were measuring something I couldn't identify. "Dr. Voss," he said, "we'll see you first. Then we'll begin orientation." "What does orientation involve?" I asked. "Mostly," he said, "walking ahead, we will tell you the rules. There are not many. But the ones we have are not negotiable, and the reason they are not negotiable is that every rule we have was written because someone broke it and something went wrong." I followed him through the gate. "How many interviews have there been before me?" I asked. He paused just slightly before answering. "Not long enough to be suspicious in isolation. Long enough that I noticed." "Several," he said. "And how many are still working here?" This pause was longer. "You," he said, "are the current one." We walked the rest of the way to the main building in silence, the ancient trees watching from beyond the perimeter, the facility humming around us with the particular quiet of a place that is never entirely still, because the things inside it are never entirely still either. I thought about the tree line behind my grandmother's house. I thought about the weight of being seen. And I walked through the door. Dr. Voss was not what I expected. I had built a picture of her during the drive, someone severe, institutional, the kind of academic who had spent so long in the company of extraordinary things that she had forgotten how to be ordinary herself. I expected authority worn like a coat. I expected distance. What I got was a small woman in her mid-70s, sitting behind a desk buried under stacked folders and handwritten notes, with reading glasses pushed up into white hair that had given up on any particular direction. She looked like someone's favorite professor. She looked like someone who baked bread on weekends and argued passionately about translation errors in 19th century anthropological texts. She looked completely, disarmingly normal. And then she looked up at me and I revised everything. Her eyes were the color of deep water and they carried the specific weight of someone who has spent a very long time looking at things that most people will never see. Not haunted, that's the wrong word. Inhabited. Like the things she had witnessed had taken up permanent residence somewhere behind her gaze and she had made peace with them living there. "Sit down, Dr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely certain. The voice of someone who has never needed volume because they have never doubted that they would be heard. "I Saturday. You have questions," she said. "Everyone does. I'm going to ask you to hold them for now and listen. When I'm finished, if you still want to ask them, I'll answer what I can. Some things I can't answer yet, not because I'm keeping secrets from you, but because there are things that are better understood through experience than explanation. Your predecessor found that frustrating. I'll tell you now so you can decide how to feel about it before we go further." "My predecessor," I said. Aldrich said I was the current interview. "What happened to the others?" She looked at me steadily. "They left. All of them voluntarily. At different points, for different reasons. The work is not for everyone, and I have never tried to keep someone who needed to go. What I will tell you is that no one has been harmed inside this facility. The protocols exist precisely to ensure that. What happens to people after they leave, the way the work changes them, the way it settles into them and rearranges things, that I cannot fully control." "How many were there?" "Before me?" 7, she said. "Over the course of 31 years. I did the math quietly. 7 interviews in 31 years. Less than one every 4 years on average. Long tenures and then sudden endings." "Tell me about the subjects," I said. She folded her hands on the desk. "We currently have 11 entities in residence," she said. I use the word entities because no other word is adequate without being reductive. They are not animals, though some have physical forms that superficially resemble what we would categorize as animal. They are not supernatural in any meaningful sense, they operate within physical reality, they occupy space, they can be observed and documented. They are simply not human. They predate us, most of them, by spans of time we don't have adequate language for. They have been present alongside human civilization in various capacities, some observed, some hidden, some actively interacting with human communities in ways that history has recorded as myth, folklore, religious experience. And they agreed to be here. I asked. To be studied. Something shifted in her expression. Not discomfort exactly. Complexity. The relationship is not precisely one of subjects and researchers, she said carefully. It is more collaborative than that. They are here because they chose to be. Several of them have been here longer than the Institute itself. The arrangement is mutual. They have things they want understood. We are the ones doing the understanding. She stood then and moved to a cabinet behind her desk, producing a single laminated card which she placed in front of me. It had 7 items on it, printed in clean black type. The rules, she said. Read them now. Memorize them. They are not suggestions. I read. 1. You do not enter an interview room without the escort of a senior staff member until you have completed full orientation for that specific subject. 2. You do not share personal information beyond your name and professional background unless the subject asks directly. If the subject asks directly, you may answer. You are not required to answer. You are strongly advised to consider carefully before you do. 3. You do not make promises. Not small ones. Not casual ones. Not ones that feel like conversational courtesy. You make no promises of any kind. 4. You do not accept anything offered to you inside an interview room, no object, no substance, no gift of any kind, without first consulting with Dr. Voss. 5. If a subject says your name in a way that feels different from how you have introduced yourself, if it uses an inflection, a form, a knowing quality that you did not give it, you end the session immediately and report to Dr. Voss. 6. You do not discuss one subject with another. They do not ask. If one asks, you end the session immediately. 7. If at any point during an interview you feel that the subject knows something about you that you have not told it, something specific, something personal, something it should have no access to, you do not react. You complete the session normally. You report to Dr. Voss afterward. You do not, under any circumstances, ask the subject how it knows. I read the list twice. Then I looked up. Rule 7, I said. Yes, said Dr. Voss. Has that happened? With previous interviews? She looked at me with those deep water eyes, and for a moment the normal grandmother impression fell away entirely and I saw what was underneath, someone who had spent 31 years at the edge of something vast and had never once flinched, but also had never once stopped being afraid in the particular way that comes not from danger but from the sustained presence of the incomprehensible. It has happened, she said, with every single one of them. The room was very quiet. And with you? I asked. She smiled then. The first smile since I'd entered the room. It was small and precise and carried 31 years in it. The very first week, she said. With the one we call the cartographer. I went in to conduct a preliminary observation, and before I had introduced myself, before I had said a single word, it looked at me across the table and it said, and I will remember this until the day I die, it said, you have been coming here for a very long time. You just didn't know it yet. She picked up the laminated card and returned it to the cabinet. I didn't ask how it knew, she said. That was the day I wrote Rule 7. I sat in that chair for another hour as she walked me through the facility's history, its protocols, its academic framework. She was precise and thorough and left very little room for interruption. When she finished, she asked if I had questions. I had approximately 40. I asked the one that mattered most. Which subject do I start with? She looked at me with an expression I would spend months trying to decode. That, she said, has already been decided. Not by me. By who? By one of them, she said. Subject for made a specific request 3 weeks ago. Before we contacted you. before we had identified you as a candidate. I felt the hairs on my arms rise slowly, one by one, in a wave. What was the request? I said. Dr. Voss picked up a single sheet of paper from her desk and read from it in a voice that was completely steady, in the way that things are steady when they have been made steady through great effort over a long period of time. It said, she read, "Send me the one who stood at the tree line. The one the forest looked back at." I have been waiting to finish that conversation for a very long time. The room was absolutely silent. Outside, through the single window, the ancient tree stood at the edge of the facility grounds. Watching. Patient as only something very old can be patient. Waiting for me to finally come inside. They made me wait 3 days before they took me to subject 4. I understood, intellectually, that this was protocol. Orientation had to be completed in sequence: facility layout, emergency procedures, documentation methodology, equipment handling, a full psychological baseline assessment administered by a quiet man named Dr. Reyes, who asked me questions for 4 hours and wrote things down in a notebook he angled away from me the entire time. There were 11 subjects in residence and I needed at minimum a surface briefing on each before I could begin active interviews with any of them. I understood all of that. I followed all of that. And for 3 days I sat in briefings and ate in the staff canteen and slept in the small, clean room they'd given me in the residential wing and told myself I was fine. I was not fine. The thing Dr. Voss had read to me from that sheet of paper had settled into me the way cold settles into a house when the heat goes out, gradually, completely, finding every room. The one who stood at the tree line. I had told no one about that memory. It was not in my published work. It was not in my personnel file. It was not something I had ever written down anywhere or spoken aloud to any person living. Subject 4 had requested me specifically. Before I had been identified. Before the Institute had even begun looking for a new interview. It had been waiting. On the morning of the 4th day, Aldrich appeared at my door after breakfast and said simply, "Today." We walked through the facility in the early grey light. Through the main building, through a connecting corridor I hadn't been shown yet, through a door that required Aldrich's keycard and a separate code and a third verification I didn't fully see. The corridor beyond was different from the rest of the facility, older feeling, quieter, lit by fixtures that produced a softer, yellower light than the clinical white of the main building. The floors were a different material. The walls were thicker. I could feel the thickness of them the way you feel the depth of a building when you go underground. There were 8 doors in the corridor. Each one was a different color. Aldrich had explained this during orientation. Each subject's room was coded by color for staff identification purposes, and also, he had said, with the particular care of someone choosing words very deliberately, because some of the subjects responded differently to different parts of the visual spectrum and the door colors were part of managing those responses. Subject 4's door was the color of deep forest. The exact green-black of old trees at dusk. Of course it was. Aldrich stopped outside it. He turned to me with an expression that was professional and carefully neutral, and underneath both of those things, quietly, deeply serious. "I'll be outside," he said. "The session runs 60 minutes by default. If you need to end early, say the word clearance clearly. I'll hear it and the door will open in under 10 seconds. You don't need to explain. You don't need to justify. You just say the word." Have previous interviewers needed to use it? I asked. In this room specifically, he said, no one has ended a session early. Is that reassuring or alarming? He considered this with more genuine thought than I expected. Both, he said. Equally. He pressed his card to the reader. The lock disengaged with a sound that was less like a mechanism releasing and more like something exhaling. A breath let out. A held thing, released. I pushed the door open and went in. The room was larger than I had anticipated. Not enormous, perhaps 30 feet across, but the ceiling was high and the space had been arranged in a way that felt less like a research room and more like somewhere someone actually lived. There were no hard institutional edges. The light was low and warm and came from several sources, none of them overhead. There were books, actual physical books, hundreds of them, on shelves that ran floor to ceiling along one wall. There was a table, wooden and old, with 2 chairs facing each other across it. One chair was empty. In the other sat Subject 4. I will try to describe it accurately. I will try to give you something that is honest rather than dramatic, because the dramatic version would be easy and wrong, and what it actually was deserves better than easy. It looked, at first, like a person. Broadly, generally, in the way that a photograph of a person looks like a person even when something about the photograph is wrong and you can't immediately identify what. It was seated, which helped. It was roughly human in proportion, 2 arms, a head, hands folded on the table in front of it. It was wearing what appeared to be clothing, layers of dark fabric that moved slightly even though the air in the room was still. Then it looked up at me and the first impression restructured itself completely. Its face was where the similarity ended. Not because it was monstrous, I want to be precise about this, because monstrous is the word people expect and it is not the right word. Its face was not monstrous. It was simply other. The features were arranged in ways that were almost familiar and then weren't, the eyes set at an angle that the human skull doesn't produce, the mouth wider than it should be and perfectly still in a way that human mouths are not still even in repose. Its skin was the color of very old wood, dark and layered, and its eyes were the color of the light that comes through forest canopy, that specific green gold that exists only in deep trees in full summer. Those eyes found me and they found me the way I described in the beginning, with the weight of being seen. Not looked at. Seen. The distinction is enormous and I will spend the rest of my life being sure of it. It said my name. Not Dr. Mercer. Not the professional title I used for introductions and had introduced myself with to every staff member I had met. My name. My full name, first, middle, last, in a voice that was low and textured and came from somewhere deeper in its chest than human voices come from. And it said it not the way a stranger says a name they have just been told. It said it the way someone says a name they have known for a very long time and are only now, finally, getting to use out loud. I remembered Rule 5. I sat down. You know my name, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of how steady it was. I have known your name, it said, since before you had it. I opened my documentation folder. I uncapped my pen. The mundane physical actions of my work, the practiced ritual of them, were the only anchor I had to the version of reality I had walked in with. I'd like to begin with some standard questions, I said. Background, history, the nature of your presence here. Is that agreeable? It watched me prepare my materials with an expression that I can only describe as fond. The way someone watches a child perform a task with great seriousness that the adult knows is unnecessary but chooses not to interrupt because the seriousness itself is precious. You can ask your standard questions, it said. We will get to them. But first I would like to tell you something. Go ahead, I said. You have been trying to forget me for 23 years, it said. You have been fairly successful. But some part of you has always known. Some part of you built your entire career, all of your work documenting how human communities make meaning at the edges of the explainable, around the thing you saw at the tree line and refused to name. My pen was motionless on the page. I wasn't hiding from you, it continued. I want you to understand that. That evening in Vermont, I wasn't there to frighten you. I was there because I had been watching you for some time and I wanted to see what you would do when you finally saw me back. What did I do? I asked. My voice came out quieter than I intended. You stood your ground, it said. For longer than any child I have observed in 1,000 years of watching children. You were afraid and you stood your ground anyway and you looked directly at me without looking away. It unfolded its hands on the table. Opened them. An oddly human gesture of openness, of having nothing concealed. That, it said, is why I asked for you. I looked down at my documentation folder. At the blank page where my notes should have begun. Then I put the pen down, looked up, and said the thing I hadn't planned to say. The thing that bypassed every professional protocol and came straight from the 7-year-old at the tree line. "What are you?" I said. And subject for smiled, a slow, wide expression that rearranged its face into something I had no framework for but felt, inexplicably and completely, like coming home. "Now," it said, "we can begin." It told me to call it Oren. Not its name, it clarified immediately. It had a name, but the name was not something human vocal architecture could produce without damage, and it had learned long ago that asking humans to attempt it created more problems than it solved. Oren was the closest approximation in any language it had found, borrowed from an old Hebrew word meaning light or ash tree, both of which it said it had always found appropriate for reasons it would explain in time. I wrote Oren at the top of my documentation page. Then I sat back and I listened. Because that was what it wanted. Not questions, not prompts, not the structured interview methodology I had spent 15 years refining. It wanted to talk, and it wanted to be heard, and the specific quality of listening it required was the same quality Dr. Voss had described in her rules, not interpreting before it finished, not reaching for the familiar handle on an unfamiliar door, but sitting with the strangeness of it and letting it be strange. It spoke for the full 60 minutes of that first session without stopping. I am going to tell you what it said not in its words, because its words were not always linear, not always in a sequence that followed the kind of logic I can transcribe, but in the shape of what I understood. The architecture of it. Oren was old. Old in a way that the word old barely touches. It described having first become aware of the thing it called continuous self, what we might call consciousness, though it was precise about the inadequacy of that word, at a point it located not by calendar date but by geological event. It had been aware before the current arrangement of continents. It had watched coastlines move. It had observed, from forested highlands that no longer existed in their original form, the slow patient work of glacier. It was not alone of its kind. That was the second thing it told me. There were others, not many, it was careful to say, who shared its nature, its age, its particular mode of existing alongside the world rather than inside it the way humans exist inside it. Most of them had retreated, over the centuries, as human civilization expanded and the spaces between things, the old dark margins where such entities had always lived most freely, grew thinner and thinner. Oren had not retreated. Oren had, in its own word, attended. It had attended human history the way a long-lived neighbor attends the life of a family in the house next door, not intruding, not controlling, but present through every season of it. It had been in the forests of what would become Europe when the first permanent settlement appeared. It had watched the oldest cities rise and, in some cases, watched them fall. It had been present, in the background, in the margins, in the particular atmospheric quality that certain places carry, that sense of being watched by something older than the stones, throughout the entire recorded span of human civilization. Why? I asked. It was the only word I managed for the first 40 minutes. Curiosity, it said, simply and without apparent performance. The same reason you document. You find us extraordinary. We find you extraordinary. The difference is you have only been doing it for a few thousand years and we have been doing it considerably longer. Do the others, the ones who retreated, do they watch too? In their own ways, it said. Some watch from great distances. Some have chosen specific places and maintained presence there across centuries, embedded in a landscape so thoroughly that the humans who live in those places encode them into their stories, their religions, their dreams, without ever knowing precisely what they are encoding. Your folklore is full of us. Your oldest fears and your oldest comforts both. I thought about every piece of ethnographic work I had ever done. Every community I had documented at the edges of the explicable, the villages with their persistent local legends, the families with their inherited intuitions about particular stretches of forest or coastline or hillside, the universal human tendency to sense presence in old places. You're in all of it, I said. We are in all of it, it confirmed. Not manipulating. Not directing. Simply, there. The way the weather is there. You don't control your lives around us, but we are a pressure in them. A quality. We are the reason your ancestors built their fires a little larger on certain nights. We are the reason certain roads, in certain parts of the world, have been avoided by local populations for 1,000 years without anyone remembering the original reason. Are you dangerous? I asked. It considered this with the particular seriousness of something that respects the question. We are powerful, it said. In ways that don't map neatly to your frameworks of danger. We don't want things from you in the ways that make entities dangerous in your stories. We don't want your lives, your souls, your obedience. What we want is considerably stranger and considerably more specific. What do you want? To be known, it said. And the echo of those words, the same words I had heard from Aria 7 in a different room in a different life, except Aria 7 was a machine learning to want things and Oren was something ancient that had always known what it wanted, landed in me with a weight I wasn't prepared for. That's why you're here, I said. Why all 11 of you are here. It's not because we're studying you. You are studying us, it said. That part is real. But the studying serves something. Dr. Voss understood this from the beginning. She is a remarkable woman, in the way that occasionally humans produce individuals who are capable of holding a much larger picture than their circumstances suggest they should be able to hold. She understood that our being known, properly known, documented in ways that would survive and circulate, was something we needed. Something with consequences. What consequences? The ones that come from being real, it said. From existing in your record. From being part of your account of the world. Right now we are myth. We are folklore. We are the thing your scientists explain away and your rationalists dismiss and your children are told they imagined. When we are documented, truly, rigorously, undeniably, we become something else. What do you become? Present, it said. Undeniably, irrevocably, present. I sat with that for a long time. There's something else, I said. You knew me specifically. Not just as a type of person, as me. My specific memory. My specific history. You asked for me by name before anyone here knew my name. The forest light eyes looked at me steadily. Yes, it said. How? It paused. And this pause was different from the others. It had the quality of a decision being made, a calculation of how much to give and in what order. There are things I have watched in you, it said, since Vermont. I did not leave after that evening. I followed your development with attention. Not interference, I want to be precise about that. I watched. I was present at certain distances. I observed the career you built and I understood, long before you applied to this institute, what you were building toward. The room temperature hadn't changed. I was certain of that. But I felt cold. You've been watching me, I said. For 23 years. Watching is the wrong weight of word, it said. Attending. The way I attend to many things. But you, yes. With particular attention. Because of what you did at the tree line. Because of what it suggested about what you were. What did it suggest? That you were someone who could do this work, it said. This specific work. Not the documentation any competent researcher can document. Something else. It paused. There are things I need to tell you that I have not told anyone who sat in that chair before you. Things I have been holding for a very long time, waiting for someone who could receive them without being broken by them. What kind of things? I said. The kind, it said quietly, that change the shape of the world you live in. Permanently. Without the possibility of going back to the shape it had before. I looked at my documentation folder. At 6 pages of notes I had taken in the last hour, more than I had ever taken in a first session with any human subject in 15 years of fieldwork. Tell me, I said. Oren looked at me across the old wooden table. The layers of dark fabric moved slightly in the still air. The forest light eyes held mine with the weight of something that had been waiting not just 3 weeks, not just 23 years, but far, far longer than either of those. It will take more than one session, it said. I have time, I said. Yes, it said. You do. That is one of the things I need to tell you about. And the session timer went off, and I walked out of that room, and I stood in the yellow-lit corridor with my documentation folder pressed against my chest and my heart going at a speed that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the feeling of standing at the beginning of something enormous. Something I had, without knowing it, been walking toward for 23 years. The sessions with Oren became the architecture of my days. Everything else at the facility, the briefings on other subjects, the documentation reviews, the meals in the staff canteen, the quiet evenings in my residential room, all of it arranged itself around those 60 minutes the way a solar system arranges itself around the thing at its center. Not because I was neglecting my other responsibilities. I wasn't. I was thorough and professional and present for every other obligation the Institute required of me. But the sessions with Oren were where I actually lived. We were 2 weeks in when it said the thing about time. I had been asking about its experience of history, trying to establish, for documentation purposes, a coherent chronological framework for its account of human civilization. This was harder than it sounds. Oren did not experience time the way I experience time. For me, time was a line, past behind, future ahead, present the point where I stood. For Oren, time was something closer to a landscape. A terrain that could be moved through in multiple directions, that had elevation and depth, that could be observed from distances that changed what was visible. It had been trying to explain this for several sessions, with the patient precision of someone translating between languages that share almost no common grammar. I had been trying to follow, with the particular concentration of someone who knows that the failure to understand is entirely on their side and not the speaker's. On the morning of our 9th session, it stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with those forest-light eyes and said, "I am going to tell you something that the rules of this institute would suggest I should not tell you." I felt the familiar cold move through me. "Go ahead," I said. "The rules say you should not ask me how I know personal things about you," it said. Dr. Voss wrote that rule because previous interviews asked, and the answers destabilized them. I have watched you for 2 weeks now in these sessions and I have made a determination. What determination? That you will not be destabilized, it said. Not because you are harder or stronger than the others, but because you have been preparing for this answer your entire life without knowing you were preparing for it. The ground has been laid. What I tell you will land on prepared ground. Tell me, I said. It folded its hands on the table. I know the things I know about you, it said, because I have been present at certain moments of your life. Not all of them. Specific ones, moments that had a particular significance, a particular quality of weight, that drew my attention the way certain atmospheric conditions draw lightning. You were there, I said carefully. At specific moments. Yes. Your father's funeral, when you were 19, and you stood at the graveside and felt, very specifically, that the grief was not only yours, that something else in the landscape was grieving with you. That was not your imagination. The pen in my hand had gone completely still. Your first fieldwork posting, in rural Ireland, when you were 26. The night you spent alone in the old cottage on the hill because the family you were documenting was away, and something moved through the walls of that cottage in the small hours and you lay absolutely still in your sleeping bag and told yourself it was wind and knew it wasn't. That was you, I said. My voice was very quiet. I was passing through, it said. I became aware of you there and I paused. I did not intend to frighten you. I was curious. You were sleeping in a place that had considerable significance for my kind, and finding a human there who felt familiar was unexpected. Familiar, I repeated. I felt familiar to you. You have felt familiar to me, it said, since Vermont. I put the pen down entirely. This was not in any documentation protocol I had ever been trained in. Why? I said. Why do I feel familiar to you? I had never encountered anything like you before that night. I was 7 years old. Oren was quiet for a moment. The fabric layers moved in the still air. When it spoke again the voice was lower, slower, carrying something it had been holding for a very long time. This is the part, it said, that concerns time. It stood up from its chair. This was the first time in 9 sessions it had stood, and the effect was considerable. It was taller than it appeared seated, and the room arranged itself differently around its standing presence, the way a room arranges itself around something that has gravity. It moved to the bookshelf and removed a very old book, not old like an antique, old like something that predated the category of antique entirely, and placed it open on the table in front of me. The pages were covered in markings that were not quite writing in any system I recognized, though they had the quality of language, purposeful, structured, carrying meaning in their arrangement. This is a record, it said. One of many I keep. It documents presences, human and otherwise, that I have observed at particular locations across particular spans of time. The location in Vermont where you lived with your grandmother. I have been recording presences, therefore it paused, as if converting a measurement into a unit I could comprehend, for what your calendar would represent as approximately 800 years. I looked at the pages. Your family, it said, appears in this record. Not just you. Your grandmother, who also saw me once, in the same place, when she was a child, and spent the rest of her life leaving small offerings at the tree line without knowing precisely why. Her mother before her. Her mother's father before that. Going back in this record, generation after generation, in that specific place, the same bloodline producing individuals who came to the tree line and stood their ground and looked back. The room was completely silent. It is not common, it said. Most humans, when they see us, look away. The looking away is not cowardice, it is a reasonable response to something the mind was not constructed to process directly. But occasionally a family produces individuals who look, who hold the gaze, who do not resolve the strangeness into something manageable and move on. Your family has been doing this for as long as I have been recording this particular location. What does it mean? I said. It means, it said carefully, that you are not here by accident. That the chain of events that brought you to this facility, to this chair, to this conversation, it is longer than you know. It did not begin with a job listing in your email inbox. It did not begin with the night in Vermont when you were 7. When did it begin? I said. That is the wrong question, it said. The better question is, what is it? What is it? It sat back down. Placed the book to one side. Looked at me with the full weight of those ancient eyes and said something that rearranged the architecture of everything I had believed about my own life. There are humans, it said, who exist in a particular relationship to what I am. Not chosen. I want to be very precise about this, because the word chosen implies an agent who chooses, and I am not that agent. It is more structural than that. More like the way certain plants grow toward light, not because anyone chose them to, but because they are built in a way that makes light-seeking inevitable. You're saying I was built this way, I said. I am saying your line was, it said. Over many generations, through a process I don't fully understand and have only been able to observe rather than explain, certain human lineages develop a permeability. A thinness at the boundary between ordinary perception and the kind of perception that can accommodate what I am. What all of us are. Your family has it. It runs through your bloodline the way certain traits run through bloodlines, not every generation, not every individual, but consistently enough that I have been watching for it. And I have it, I said. You have it more strongly than anyone in your line I have documented, it said. By a significant degree. That night in Vermont, you were 7 years old and you held my gaze for 4 minutes and 30 seconds without looking away. I have been watching this location for 8 centuries. No child has ever done that. I sat with that for a long time. The others, I said finally. The other interviews. Did they have this permeability? To lesser degrees, it said. The Institute has always, whether Dr. Voss consciously recognized it or not, attracted individuals with some version of it. It is part of why the work is possible at all. But you? It stopped. What? I said. You are why I came to this facility, it said. Not the other way around. I identified you 23 years ago at a tree line in Vermont, and I have been waiting, with the patience that comes from having waited for much longer things, for you to arrive at the point where this conversation was possible." The timer went off. I looked at my documentation pages. 12 pages of notes, dense and barely legible, the handwriting of someone trying to keep pace with something moving faster than handwriting allows. I looked up at Oren. "Tomorrow," I said. "There's more." "There is considerably more," it said. "But I want you to sit with this part first. Walk with it tonight. Let it settle into you. Will I be okay?" I said. The question surprised me as I asked it. It was not a professional question. It was the question of the 7-year-old at the tree line. Oren looked at me with something that I had no word for and have no word for still. Something that was not pity and not reassurance, but contained elements of both and transcended them into a third thing entirely. "You have always been okay," it said. "Even when you didn't know it. Even in the moments that felt least okay. I was there for several of them. You were always okay." I stood. Gathered my notes. Walked to the door. "Oren," I said, with my hand on the handle. "Yes." "My grandmother. The offering she left at the tree line. Did you ever?" I acknowledged them, it said quietly. "Everyone." She never saw me directly. But she felt the acknowledgement. I made sure of that. I opened the door and walked into the yellow corridor and stood there for a long time before my legs remembered how to carry me forward. My grandmother had died 3 years ago. She had left me, in her will, a single item separate from everything else, a small smooth stone she had kept on her windowsill for as long as I could remember, worn pale and perfectly round, that she had found, according to a note she left with it, at the tree line behind her house. I had it in my room. I had carried it without knowing why. I knew now. It was the night of my 31st day at the facility when the rules broke down. Not all of them. Not catastrophically. But the specific rule that had always felt most fragile, Rule 6, the one that said the subjects did not ask about each other, the one whose quiet authority had always rested on the assumption that whatever arrangements existed between the 11 entities in that corridor were stable and had always been stable. That rule cracked at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and what came through the crack changed everything that came after. I was in my residential room, working through the day's documentation. This had become my nightly ritual, 3 hours after dinner, converting the raw density of my session notes into something approaching coherent record, cross-referencing against previous sessions, flagging the threads that needed following in whatever came next. It was the kind of work that required quiet, and I had come to love the particular quiet of the facility at night, when the administrative sounds of the day settled and the building found its own rhythm. At 11:42, that rhythm changed. I noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping rather than a sound starting. A baseline that had been constant was suddenly absent, and the absence had texture. The faint ambient hum of the facility's systems, the subtle white noise of a building that was never entirely still, went quieter in a specific way. Not a power failure. Something more deliberate than that. I put down my pen. At 11:45, something moved in the corridor outside my room. My residential room was in the staff wing, which was separated from the subject corridor by 2 keycard doors and a connecting passage. The footstep sounds, if they were footstep sounds, and I use that term with full awareness of its inadequacy, were coming from the connecting passage. The space between the 2 wings that should have been empty at this hour. I sat very still for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I know the duration precisely because I was watching the clock on my documentation laptop with the particular focus of someone whose mind needs something concrete to hold on to. At 11:47, someone knocked on my door. 3 knocks. Evenly spaced. Patient. I opened it. The corridor outside my room was empty. The connecting passage at the far end was dark. But the air in the corridor was different. It had the quality that I had, over 31 days, come to associate specifically with the subject wing. That ancient, layered quality, like air that had been breathed by very old things for a very long time. It had no business being in the staff wing. And on the floor outside my door, placed with obvious deliberateness in the center of the threshold, was a single object. A stone. Small, smooth, perfectly round, worn pale. Identical to the one my grandmother had left me. Identical to the one sitting on my desk 6 feet away. I picked it up. It was warm in a way that stones are not warm. The warmth of something recently held. I went back inside. I placed the 2 stones side by side on my desk. They were not merely similar. They were, and I choose this word with full awareness of how impossible it is, identical. Not just in size and shape and color. In the specific pattern of wear on their surfaces. In the particular way the light caught them. They were the same stone. I did not sleep that night. In the morning I went to Dr. Voss before breakfast and told her what had happened. I placed both stones on her desk. She looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then she looked up at me with those deep water eyes and said, "This has not happened before." "Which part?" I said. "Any of it," she said. "The corridor. The knock. The stone." She paused. "They don't leave their rooms at night. That has been consistent for 31 years. Whatever arrangements exist between them, whatever communication occurs, and I have always known that some communication occurs, the nature of which I have never been able to document, it happens in ways that don't involve physical movement through this facility. Until last night," I said. "Until last night," she said. She picked up one of the stones and held it. Her expression was very controlled, and underneath the control was something I recognized as the specific fear that comes not from danger but from the sudden expansion of the unknown. From the horizon moving. "I need to speak with Oren before your session today." "What will you ask it?" "I'll ask it what changed," she said. 31 years of a particular equilibrium doesn't shift without a reason. She met with Oren for 40 minutes before my session. She came out of the forest green door with her white hair slightly less organized than usual and a look on her face that I had not seen from her before. Not alarmed exactly. Recalibrated. "It will explain," she said to me. "In your session. I'm going to ask you to let it lead. Don't redirect. Don't apply the standard framework. Just listen." I went in. Oren was not seated at the table. It was standing at the bookshelf, its back to the door, running its fingers along the spines of the old volumes with a slow, deliberate attention. It didn't turn when I entered. "Last night," I said. "Last night," it agreed. It turned. Its expression was different from any I had seen across 31 days of sessions. More open. Less patient. As if something that had been contained had been, not released exactly, but acknowledged. "The stone," I said. "Was a message," it said. "Not from me." I sat down slowly. "From who?" "From the others," it said. "It came to the table on Saturday. I told you, 5 sessions ago, that there are things I have been holding for someone who could receive them. What I did not tell you, what I was not yet certain enough to tell you, was that the holding has not only been mine. The others have been holding things too," I said. "We have been holding them together," it said. "For a very long time. The 11 of us who are here did not arrive separately or by coincidence. We came together, over years, because of a specific shared understanding. A thing that each of us knows a part of, that none of us knows completely, that requires a particular kind of human witness to be fully assembled." "A witness," I said. "That's what I'm here for." "That's what you were built for," it said. "In the sense I described before, structurally, across generations. The permeability in your line, the long history of your family at that tree line, the particular quality of attention you carry, it was not random. It was not accident. It was the slow patient work of a very long preparation. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. Prepared by who? By all of us, it said. By what we are. by the pressure we've exerted, across centuries, on the specific landscape your family has inhabited. Not manipulation, I need you to hold on to that. We did not interfere with your family's choices or your own. But we were present in the environment that shaped those choices. The way a river is present in the landscape that the river also shaped. You shaped my family, I said. We shaped the ground, it said. Your family did the rest. I sat with that distinction for a long moment. Then, what is the thing? The thing you've been holding together. The thing that needs assembling. Oren placed both hands flat on the table. There is a truth, it said, about the relationship between what we are and what you are. About the nature of the boundary between human perception and the larger world. About why that boundary exists, how it was formed, and what it costs, on both sides, to maintain it. What does it cost? I said. On your side, it said, it costs the full shape of the world. Humans live in a version of reality that is, not false, I want to be precise, but partial. Bounded. The boundary is not a conspiracy. It is not something we imposed. It formed naturally, the way a scar forms, as a response to something the system couldn't integrate without damage. Your ancestors encountered us fully, in the early millennia, before the boundary had formed, and the encounter was. It stopped. What? I said. Transformative, it said carefully. In ways that were not always survivable. The boundary formed because full unmediated contact with what we are is more than the human perceptual system was built to absorb. It is a protective structure. We have respected it. But now you don't want to respect it, I said. That's what this is. Not remove it, it said quickly. Never remove it without preparation. What we want, what we have been building toward, across all of these years, with all of this patience, is a mediated opening. A controlled and careful and fully consensual widening. Not for everyone. For someone specifically prepared to hold it without breaking. The room was completely still. For me, I said. For you, it said. I thought about the knock on my door at 11:47. The stone on the threshold. 11 entities in a corridor that had been stable for 31 years, moving in the dark, placing something carefully at my door as a collective announcement. We are ready. Are you? What does it involve? I said. A session, it said. Not like these. All 11 of us, together, with you. A single conversation in which each of us gives you the part of the truth we hold, and together they form the whole. It will take as long as it takes. It will not be comfortable. It will not be reversible. And afterward? I said. What am I afterward? Oren looked at me with those forest-light eyes, and this time the expression was not fond or patient or ancient. It was something far more immediate than any of those. Afterward, it said, you will be someone who knows the full shape of the world. What you do with that, how you carry it, what you build from it, who you tell and how you tell them, that will be entirely yours. We give you the truth. What becomes of the truth is your work, not ours. The timer went off. I stood. My legs were steady. I was surprised by that. When? I said. When you are ready, it said. We will know. I walked out into the yellow corridor. All 8 colored doors stood closed and still. But the air in the corridor had that quality again, ancient, layered, breathing. Not with one presence. With 11. All of them attending. Waiting for the answer they already knew was coming. I told them I was ready on a Thursday morning. I didn't announce it formally. I didn't schedule it through Aldrich or notify Dr. Voss in advance. I simply walked to the corridor at 7 in the morning before anyone else in the facility had fully begun their day, stood in the yellow-lit hallway with its 8 colored doors, and said it out loud to the air. I'm ready. The air changed. That ancient layered quality shifted, the way a held breath shifts when it is finally released, and every door in the corridor produced a sound simultaneously, not a mechanical sound, not the click of locks or the movement of handles, but something more like the sound a forest makes when wind moves through it all at once. A collective exhale. A recognition. Oren's door, the forest green one, opened first. "Come in," it said, from inside. "All of us are already here." I pushed the door open. The room was different. The table was gone. The 2 chairs were gone. The space had been arranged, and I do not know how, and I did not ask how, because some questions are less important than the thing in front of you, into a wide circle. 11 presences, seated or standing or existing in postures my vocabulary doesn't have adequate words for, arranged around a center point that was empty and waiting. For me. I walked to the center and I stood there and I looked around the circle. I will not describe all 11 of them in detail. Partly because some of what I saw in that room I am still in the process of finding language for. Partly because the descriptions would take more space than the truth they were present to deliver, and the truth is what matters. What I will tell you is that they were various, radically, extraordinarily various, in their forms and their qualities and the specific type of ancientness they carried. Some were close to what I had known Oren to be. Some were further from anything I had a reference point for. All of them looked at me with the specific weight of being seen. All of them, in that moment, felt familiar. Not because I had met them. Because I had been, in some deep structural sense that I now understood was written into my bloodline and my years and the specific shape of my life, always moving toward this room. Always building toward this circle. Oren spoke first. "We begin," it said, "with what we are." What followed I can only describe as a conversation that moved in ways conversations don't move. Not one voice and then another in sequence. Not a presentation or a lecture or a structured revelation. It was more like a chord. Multiple things sounding at once, not cancelling each other out but combining into something that was more than any individual part, that required all the parts to become itself. They told me what they were. Not the words for it, the actual nature of it, communicated in a way that bypassed language and landed directly in understanding. I felt it arrive in me the way you feel warmth arrive when you come inside from the cold, not a concept, not a description, but a physical reality settling into the body. What they were was not supernatural. Not magical. Not outside the boundaries of a physical universe. They were instead, and I reach for this analogy knowing it is only an analogy, something like a different layer of the same document. The world I had lived in all my life was real and complete. And underneath it, woven through it, older than it, was another layer of the same reality that human perception, for reasons of structural self-preservation, had learned not to see. The boundary was not a wall. It was a frequency. Humans were tuned to one channel and the world carried many, and the decision, not a conscious decision, not anyone's decision, but an evolutionary one made across millennia of encounter and overwhelm, to hear only one channel had been made so long ago it had become invisible. Had become what people meant when they said reality. I understood this in the way you understand a thing when it is shown to you rather than explained. When the experience is the teaching. Then they told me why. Why the boundary had formed, yes, that part Oren had given me already. But the fuller why. The why underneath the why. Why it mattered, now, in this specific moment of human history, that someone cross it deliberately and carefully and with full preparation. The world was reaching a threshold. Not an apocalypse. I want to be precise about this because the word threshold will make certain readers reach for that frame and it is the wrong one. Not an ending. A transition. The kind that occurs in long systems when accumulated pressure reaches a point that requires a structural response. Human civilization had been building pressure against the boundary for centuries, through its science, through its technology, through its expanding capacity to detect and measure and document things at scales and resolutions that were beginning to brush against the edges of what the boundary was designed to contain. The boundary was not going to hold indefinitely. This was not a threat. It was a geological fact stated without drama. The question was not whether it would change but how. Whether the change would be, and they used a word I am translating here because the original was not in any human language, graceful. An ungraceful opening would look like madness. Like the mass production of experiences that human perceptual systems were not built to integrate without preparation. Like the thing that happened in the early millennia, before the boundary existed, when the encounters were unmediated and transformative and frequently unsurvivable. A graceful opening required witnesses. People with the particular permeability to receive what was coming without breaking. People who could then become translators, not just documenters, not just recorders, but active intermediaries between the two layers of the same world, who could help build the frameworks, the language, the cultural structures that would allow what was coming to arrive without catastrophe. My family had been in preparation for this for 800 years. Without knowing. Without being told. The presence of these entities at the tree line in Vermont, generation after generation, had been the slow, patient work of building permeability into a bloodline the way you build a levee, not to stop the water but to ensure that when the water comes it flows where it can do the most good rather than the most damage. I was the current endpoint of that work. I was the most permeable person in a line that had been built specifically toward permeability. And the threshold was close. I stood in the center of the circle and I felt all of this arrive in me, and I want to tell you that I was afraid, because that would be the honest response, the proportionate response, the response that makes me a reliable narrator. And I was afraid. In the way that you are afraid at the top of the highest place you have ever climbed, when the view opens up and the scale of everything below and above you simultaneously becomes real and your body registers it as danger even as your mind registers it as the most extraordinary thing it has ever seen. Both at once. Equally. They gave me the last piece at the end. Not delivered by Oren. By the oldest of them, an entity I had not previously been introduced to, that had been present in the circle at a position that I now understood had always been the anchor point, the oldest weight in the room. It had no form I could describe directly. It existed in the circle as a quality rather than a shape, a deep, geological patience, a presence so old it had passed through form and out the other side into something more elemental. It spoke without speaking. Put something in me that was not words and was also not less than words. The truth underneath all the other truths. This, the two layers of the world, the human one and the older one, needed each other. Had always needed each other. The human layer brought something the older layer did not have and could not generate alone. Something about the human relationship to time, to mortality, to the specific urgency that comes from living a short life in a large world. Something about the particular way humans loved things, fiercely, impermanently, with the desperate tenderness of creatures who know that everything they love will end. That quality, immortal love, finite love, the love that burns brighter because the burn has an edge, was something the old things could observe but not produce. Could document across centuries but never replicate. And what the older layer brought to the human one, the deep time, the patience, the knowledge of how large the world actually was, the ability to hold the full shape of it, was the container. The long perspective in which human urgency could burn without consuming itself. They needed each other. Had always needed each other. The boundary had been a mistake. A necessary mistake, a survivable mistake, a mistake that had allowed human civilization to develop the resilience it needed before the meeting could happen safely. But a mistake nonetheless. And the work of this institute, of these entities, of my family across 8 centuries, of the specific preparation that had produced me, it had all been building toward the correction of that mistake. Toward 2 layers of the same world, finally, meeting without damage. The circle was quiet when it finished. I stood in the center of it for a long time. Then I sat down, cross-legged on the floor, and I opened my documentation folder, and I turned to a blank page. From the beginning, I said. All of you. I want the full record. Oren made a sound I had not heard it make before. It took me a moment to identify because it was the last thing I expected. It was laughing. A low, warm, ancient sound, like wind through trees so old they have forgotten they were ever saplings. There it is, it said. 800 years of preparation. And at the end of it, a researcher with a pen. A researcher with a pen, I agreed. Who stood at the tree line and didn't look away. Let's begin. And we began. I am writing this from a small house at the edge of a forest in Vermont. Not my grandmother's house, that was sold years ago, but a house I found within walking distance of the same tree line, in the same landscape, under the same ancient trees. I came here 6 months after leaving the facility because I needed to be somewhere the ground was prepared. Somewhere that knew me by bloodline. The documentation runs to 11 volumes now. It is the most important work I have ever done. It is also the most difficult to know what to do with, how to release it, in what form, to whom, at what pace, with what preparation for the people who will receive it. These are questions I am working through carefully. The entities are patient with the pace of it. They have, after all, been waiting considerably longer than this. There are things I know now that I cannot know. The full shape of the world is not a comfortable thing to carry every day. It requires constant adjustment, the way your eyes require constant adjustment when you move between different qualities of light. Some mornings I stand at the tree line and I feel the weight of all of it, the deep time, the 2 layers, the threshold that is still approaching, the work that is still to do, and it is almost too much to hold standing upright. Then I remember what Oren told me. In the sessions, across the weeks, in the yellow-lit corridor in a facility at the end of an unmapped road. You have always been okay. Even when you didn't know it. Even in the moments that felt least okay. I carry that the way I carry the stone from my grandmother. Worn smooth with handling. Warm in the hand. Some evenings, at the tree line, when the light is going and the old trees are doing the thing they do in late October, that October thing, that smell of cold earth and deep time and something underneath both that has no name, I feel it. The weight of being seen. The particular quality of a very old attention resting on me. I don't look away. I haven't looked away since I was 7 years old. I don't intend to start now. I stand at the tree line. I look back. And from the deep dark between the ancient trees, something that has been watching my family for 800 years looks back at me. And it is not frightening. It is the most familiar thing in the world.